Okay, so we should have here our last read aloud for our story Wayside School is Falling Down. We are on chapter 28. Waloosh. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. I have some wonderful news, she said. The children stopped what they were doing and looked up. They waited for Mrs. Jules to tell them the wonderful news. You are a very lucky class indeed, said Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Waloosh, the famous world dancer, will be coming here to Wayside School. She will teach you how to dance. Everyone was still waiting for the wonderful news. Isn't that exciting? Asked Mrs. Jules. You will see her every Wednesday instead of going to PE. Will the girls have to dance with the boys? Asked Jenny. I suppose, said Mrs. Jules. Gross, exclaimed Leslie. Yuck, said Dana. Will boys have to dance with the girls? Asked Ron. Obviously, said Mrs. Jules. No way, said Eric Fry. I'd rather dance with a dead rat, said Terence. Everyone started talking at once about cooties and warts and other horrible diseases you get from touching girls or boys. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell again and told them to settle down. Mrs. Jules, I don't need to take dancing lessons, said Eric Bacon. I already know how to dance. Yes, Eric, I've seen you dance, Mrs. Jules said sarcastically. Eric Bacon is a great break dancer, but break dancing is no longer allowed at Wayside School. That was because every time Eric danced, he broke something. Mrs. Waloosh will teach you the grace and beauty of classical ballroom dancing, said Mrs. Jules. Everybody groaned. On Wednesday, they all headed down to their first dancing lesson, except Myron. Myron went to PE. How come Myron never has to do anything? Asked Jason. I don't know, said Calvin. I've been wondering about that too. Myron's father must be friends with the president, said BB. I think Myron gave Mr. Kidswatter $1,000, said Todd. No, I bet he's blackmailing Mrs. Jules, said Ginny. Well, how could he do that? Asked Benjamin. Maybe Mrs. Jules drank too much, said Ginny, and then she danced on top of her desk with a lampshade on her head, and Myron took a picture of her. And so now Mrs. Jules has to let Myron do anything he wants, or else he'll show the picture to Mr. Kidswatter. That makes sense, said Mac. Except if she had a lampshade on her head, how would Mr. Kidswatter know it was Mrs. Jules? Asked Todd. No one knew the answer to that. They entered the room on the second floor. Welcome, said Mrs. Waloosh, a strange-looking woman with bright red hair. She looked like her head was on fire. My name is Miss Waloosh. It's so wonderful to be here at Wayside School. She wore pink tights and a sparkling pink top. I hope we will be friends. Yes? She asked. Nobody said a word. All around were red and green balls. There was also one yellow ball. This was the room where Louis kept the balls for lunch and recess. It was also the room that was always used for school dances. It was the ballroom. So, exclaimed Mrs. Waloosh, who will be first? Everyone tried to hide behind someone else. Mrs. Waloosh put up her hands on Ron's face. What is your name? She asked. Ron, he squeaked. Ronaldo, bellowed Mrs. Waloosh, king of the gypsies. I don't know how to dance, said Ron. Dance? asked Mrs. Waloosh. She looked very surprised. We are not going to dance, she said. We're not? asked Ron. No, Ronaldo, whispered Miss Waloosh. We are going to tango. She put her left arm around Ron's waist, and she grabbed his left hand with her right and stuck it out way in front of them. Suddenly the music started. Mrs. Waloosh dragged poor Ron across the room as she stomped her feet to the time of the music. Dum, da dum, da dum, da dum, 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 dum. Hey! Then when she yelled hey, she threw Ron up in the air and clapped her hands. Ron turned a somersault in midair, and then Mrs. Waloosh caught him. They tangoed back to where they started. Ron's eyes were spinning in opposite directions. Hey, that looked like fun, said Mauricia. Do me. Very well, said Mrs. Waloosh. She grabbed Mauricia and tangled with her across the room. Hey, she said again, and threw Mauricia up into the air and clapped her hands. Mauricia turned a double somersault before Mrs. Waloosh caught her. They tangled back to the front. My turn, said Terence, and Mrs. Waloosh tangled with Terence, and the other kids stomped to their feet along with Mrs. Waloosh. They all yelled hey at the same time and clapped their hands. One by one, Mrs. Walush tangled with every kid in the class. The other kids danced with each other. Boys danced with girls, girls danced with boys. They didn't care. Paul danced with Leslie. Dana danced with John. Terrence danced with Rondi. Allison danced with Jason. DJ danced with Kathy, and Todd danced with Joy. Hey, they all shouted together. Of course, they weren't strong enough to throw each other up in the air. Instead, they tried to trip each other and throw each other on the ground. Hey, even Kathy was having fun. Hey, she shouted as she kicked DJ in the rear end. They also threw the balls at each other. Hey! Mrs. Walush began to get tired. Sometimes she didn't catch the children after she tossed them in the air. Dee Dee crashed to the floor. Wow, she said. This is more fun than the murder the man with the ball. Hey! At last the music stopped and all the kids yelled hey one last time. Mrs. Walush clapped her hands. Wonderful children, she exclaimed. Fantastic! They all staggered out of the ballroom, cut up, bruised, and bleeding. Next week is the waltz, Mrs. Walush called after them. So how did everyone like dancing? Mrs. Jules asked when they returned. Dance? asked Ronaldo, king of the gypsies. We didn't dance. You didn't? asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Ronaldo. We tangoed. Everyone cheered. It's it was wonderful, exclaimed Kathy. Fantastic, said Terence. Myron was sorry he had missed it. I can't wait till next Wednesday, said Todd. Chapter 29, The Lost Ear. Mrs. Jules was teaching the class about mammals. All mammals have hair, she said. Phoebe raised her hand. Is my father a mammal? She asked. Yes, all people are mammals, said Mrs. Jules. But my father doesn't have any hair, said Phoebe. He's bald. And everybody laughed. Benjamin stared down at his desktop. He was very determined. Mrs. Jules would be handing out report cards at the end of the week. He had to tell her his real name before then. He raised his hand. But Mac also raised his hand. Yes, Mac, said Mrs. Jules. I heard about a man who was getting his hair cut, said Mac, and the barber cut off one of the man's ears. See, the man had very long hair. I think he was a hippie or something. So the barber couldn't see his ear until it fell onto the floor. Thank you, Mac, said Mrs. Jules. That was a very interesting story. But I'm not finished, said Mac. When the barber saw the ear on the floor, he said, Is that your ear on the floor? And then the hippie said, What? I can't hear you. So the barber showed him the ear, and then they called the ambulance to take the hippie to the hospital. Were they able to put his ear back on? asked Todd. Well, see, said Mac, the doctors were all set to sew it onto his head. They were in the operating room and everything, but suddenly they couldn't find the ear. Man, they looked for it everywhere. Did they look under the operating table? asked Joy. Yep, said Mac, but it wasn't there. How about in the bathroom? said Eric Bacon. Maybe they lost it when they washed their hands. They looked, but it wasn't there, said Mac. Did they leave it at the barber shop? asked Jimmy. Nope. Did they find it? asked Allison. Yes, said Mac, but you'll never guess where. In the refrigerator, grumbled Mrs. Jules. No, how would it get there? asked Mac. Well, we really need to get back to our conversation about mammals, said Mrs. Jules. Yes, Mark. Benjamin lowered his hand. My name's not Mark, he said. My name is really Benjamin Neshmut, and I came from Hippleton and not Madagonia. Okay, that's fine, said Mrs. Jules, but we're talking about mammals. Now, the whale is the largest mammal. Even though it lives in the ocean, it is still a mammal and not a fish. Do whales have hair? asked John. Yes, said Mrs. Jules, and Dana laughed. A whale with pigtails, she exclaimed. Boy, I'd love to pull one of those, said Paul. Benjamin couldn't believe it. Did you hear what I just said? he asked. Yes, Benjamin, said Mrs. Jules. Well, don't you think I'm strange? asked Benjamin. All this time you've been calling me the wrong name, and I never told you. Don't you think I'm crazy? No, said Mrs. Jules. Benjamin was getting upset. Well, I don't think don't you think it's a stupid name, Benjamin Neshmut? He looked around at his classmates. Doesn't anybody think I'm weird? No, you're not weird, said Sherry. I'll tell you what's weird. What's weird is bringing a hobo to school for show and tell, and I'm the one who did that, so I'm weird. That's not weird, said Phoebe. What's weird is telling everyone you have a brother when you don't. I'm the weirdo. You called that weird? exclaimed Stephen. I'm weird. I'm the one. Who else would choke himself just to look nice? That's not weird, said Ginny. That's normal. Try reading a story backwards. That's weird. I'm the weird one in this class. That's a laugh, said Rondi. If you're so weird, then how come you never asked Louis to kick you in the teeth? I'm the one who's weird. No, that's not crazy, said Todd. I'll tell you what's crazy. What's crazy is that we all go to school on the 30th floor and the bathrooms are all the way down on the first. Everyone agreed with that, even Mrs. Jules. Benjamin shook his head. What a bunch of weirdos, he thought. Then he smiled. He felt proud to be a part of a class where nobody was strange because nobody was normal. Oh, this must be your lunch, said Mrs. Jules. She gave Benjamin a white paper sack that had been sitting on her desk since Benjamin's first day of school. At lunch, Allison headed down the stairs. Mark, she exclaimed. Hi, Allison, said Mark Miller. Long time no see. He carried a white paper sack just like Benjamin's. Allison was afraid she was back on the 19th story. Don't worry, said Mark. Suddenly, everyone realized my name was Mark Miller and not Benjamin Neshma, and then Mrs. Zarbs gave me this bag and told me to take it to the hospital. Is that your lunch? Said Allison. Look inside, said Mark. He handed her the bag, and Allison looked inside. There was an ear. Allison's eyes lit up. How'd that get in there? She exclaimed. I understand everything. There is no Miss Zarbs. See, Mac was talking about the ear, then Mark Miller. Benjamin Neshma, and his name wasn't Mark Miller, so that means you. What? Asked Mark. Allison suddenly looked very confused. Never mind, she mumbled. And just for a second, Allison had understood everything, but then she had lost it.